You've written your last name thousands of times, on school forms, on job applications, on official documents you signed without reading, on birthday cards, maybe on a lease, maybe in a church register, maybe on a hospital bracelet the day someone you loved was born, or the day they died. You wrote it without thinking. You've been writing it your whole life. But here's what nobody told you. That name, the one you've signed so many times it became automatic, is not just a label. It's not just a sound your parents passed down because their parents passed it down. It's a coordinate, a compass point, a fragment of a map that leads somewhere specific, somewhere real, somewhere that existed before your country existed, before your language existed, before most of the borders on any modern map were drawn. And if your last name is Irish, truly Irish, Gaelic Irish, that coordinate points back to something extraordinary. It points back to a kingdom, not a metaphor, not a legend. A kingdom, with territory, with armies, with kings whose names appear in manuscripts written by candlelight in stone monasteries over 1,000 years ago, with battles recorded in chronicles that survived Viking raids, Norman conquest, Tudor suppression, and 8 centuries of deliberate, systematic erasure. Today we're going to decode 10 of those names, 10 Irish surnames, 10 Gaelic kingdoms, 10 bloodlines that carry history inside them, history that was almost destroyed, that the people who held power spent centuries trying to erase, and somehow survived anyway, hidden in plain sight, in the name you've been writing your whole life without knowing what it meant. Before we go further, let me tell you which entry to watch for. Number 4 is going to surprise you. It doesn't connect to Irish kings. It connects to something older and stranger, a warrior tradition so feared that even the English colonial administration documented it with a kind of reluctant respect. English commanders in the 16th century wrote reports about these fighters. Those reports still exist. When you hear number 4, you'll understand why. And number 1, stay until number 1. Because the surname at the top of this list doesn't just connect you to a Gaelic kingdom. It connects you, potentially, genetically, measurably, to the most powerful bloodline in Irish history. A 2006 genetic study, published in the Proceedings of the Royal Irish Academy, identified a specific Y chromosome signature carried today by approximately 3 million men worldwide. 3 million. 1 in 12 men born in Ireland carries it right now, and the surnames connected to that lineage all trace back to a single figure. We'll get there. But first, let's talk about what Irish surnames actually are and why most people, even people who are Irish, even people who are proud of being Irish, have never been told the real story. Here's what you probably learned somewhere along the way. Irish surnames usually start with O or Mac. O means grandson of or descendant of. Mac means son of. So O'Neill means descendant of Niall. MacMurrough means son of Murchad. That's the surface. That's the part they teach you. What they don't teach you is the context. They don't tell you that these naming systems weren't just family conventions. They were political declarations. They were identity documents in a world without identity documents. In Gaelic Ireland, your surname told anyone who needed to know exactly who you were, which dynasty you belonged to, which territory your family governed or served, which king had the right to call on you in times of war. Your name was your allegiance. Your name was your rank. Your name was your history, compressed into a word you could say out loud in 2 seconds. And then the English came. And they spent roughly 400 years trying to erase those names, sometimes by force. During the penal laws era, Irish-speaking Catholic families were legally disadvantaged in ways that made it practically necessary to anglicize, to distort, translate, or simply abandon the Gaelic form of their name. O'Brien became Brian, or even Bryant. Mac Geolla Criost became Christy, or Christ, stripped of the Mac entirely. Entire lineages were linguistically dismantled, their connection to Gaelic kingdoms buried under English phonetics. I know what some of you are thinking right now. You're thinking, that was a long time ago. Surnames change. This is just etymology. It doesn't mean anything real about who someone is today. And here's why that's exactly wrong. In 2006, researchers at Trinity College Dublin, working with genealogical data and population genetics, published findings on Y chromosome distribution across Ireland. The Y chromosome passes from father to son, generation after generation, nearly unchanged. It's a genetic document, and what they found was that specific Y chromosome signatures, genetic patterns that originated in specific Gaelic dynasties, are still detectable, still concentrated in specific regions of Ireland, still disproportionately associated with specific surnames. The history didn't disappear. It went underground, into the genetics, into the names. The names survived, and they carried the history with them. Now, let's talk about the 10. These are not the most common Irish surnames. Some of the names on this list you may have never heard. Some of them, if you search them today, will return very few results, because the families that carried them were small, or scattered, or nearly destroyed by the events of Irish history. But each one of them connects to a specific Gaelic kingdom, a specific dynasty, a specific territory that existed in Ireland before the Norman invasion of 1169, and in some cases long before that. We're going in order, 10 down to 1, and here is the rule I want you to hold on to as we go through each entry. These names are not mythology. Everything I'm going to tell you is sourced from historical records, from the Annals of Ulster, the Annals of Connaught, the Annals of the Four Masters, from genealogical manuscripts preserved in the Royal Irish Academy, from records held at the Irish Manuscripts Commission, from genetic studies published in peer-reviewed journals. These are not folk stories. These are documented histories. They were just documented in Irish, in manuscripts that most people never access, and then deliberately kept out of the mainstream education system for generations. What you're about to hear is what was in those documents. And if your name is on this list, if the name you've been signing on forms and cards and official documents your whole life appears in the next few minutes, then what you're about to hear is yours. It was always yours. Someone just forgot to hand it to you. Don't move past this moment yet. Think about your grandmother. Think about your grandfather. Think about the oldest member of your family you can remember, the one who maybe knew a few words of Irish, or the one who didn't know any but had the look, the one who told you to be proud of the name without being able to explain exactly why. They were right to be proud. They just didn't have this information. By the time we reach number 1, you will. Let's begin. Number 10 on our list is a name that sounds, in its modern English form, almost ordinary. You've met people with this name. You've probably seen it on a pub sign, or a sports jersey, or a business card. It's one of the most common names in Ireland today, and precisely because it's so common, people assume it's simple. It is not simple. Put it back into its original Gaelic form, and the history it contains will change how you hear it forever. The name is O Cealai. You know it as Kelly, or O'Kelly. The Gaelic root, Tílach, does not mean what most people think. It does not mean church or bright-headed or any of the gentle interpretations you'll find in popular baby name books. Tílach, in its earliest recorded usage, meant something closer to contention. Strife, the act of fighting specifically, one who engages in battle. This was not an accident. This was a declaration of character. The family that carried this name governed a kingdom called Uí Main, the ancient Gaelic kingdom of Western Connaught, covering territory in what is now counties Galway and Roscommon. The O Cealai dynasty appear in the Annals of Connaught, one of the most detailed medieval Irish chronicles that survive to the present day. Repeatedly documented as kings and chieftains who held this territory through the Viking Age, through the Norman invasion of 1169, and long after. What makes the O Cealai story remarkable is persistence. Most Gaelic dynasties were broken by the Normans within a generation or two after 1169. The organizational and military power of Norman feudal structure was devastating to the older Gaelic system. Kingdom after kingdom fell, absorbed or displaced. The O Cealai held on. Their territorial authority in Connaught survived for an extraordinary period, not fully dismantled until the systematic land confiscations of the 16th and 17th centuries, when the Tudor and Stuart administrations stripped Gaelic families of land in waves that reshaped Irish society permanently. Over 1,000 years of territorial authority, in one family, under one name. If your name is Kelly or O'Kelly, your bloodline governed a kingdom in Western Ireland across a span of time longer than the entire history of the United States times 4. And that's just number 10. His name was Brian. Not Brian as a first name the way you'd see it today on a coffee cup or a name tag. Brian as a declaration. Brian as a title earned through 30 years of war, diplomacy, alliance building, and the kind of strategic intelligence that appears maybe once in a generation. If a civilization is lucky, he united the Irish kingdoms. All of them. Not through birth alone, not through inherited privilege, through force, through skill, and through something rarer than either, the ability to make men who had spent generations fighting each other agree, at least temporarily, that one man deserved to lead them all. He was recognized as Ard Rí, High King, not of a province, of Ireland, and then he died on the day he won his greatest victory. Number 9. O'Brien. You know it as O'Brien. The name means exactly what it says, descendants of Brian. Specifically, descendants of Brian Boru, the High King of Ireland, who defeated the combined Viking and Leinster forces at the Battle of Clontarf on the 23rd of April, 1014, the single most celebrated military engagement in Irish history. The battle that ended the era of large-scale Viking military power in Ireland. Brian Boru did not just win a battle, he built something that had never existed before him and has never fully existed since. He constructed a political framework that brought the Gaelic kingdoms of Ireland into a functioning hierarchy under one recognized authority, not through ancestry alone, but through demonstrated military and political legitimacy. Medieval Irish political theory recognized a concept called the Ard Rí na Haireann, the High King of all Ireland. The title existed before Brian, but it was largely ceremonial, or contested, or held by one dynasty at the expense of all the others who refused to recognize it. Brian made it real. He campaigned systematically across the island. He negotiated where he could. He fought where he had to. He received submission, documented, recorded submission, from every major Irish kingdom. The Book of Armagh, one of the most important manuscripts in Irish history, contains a note added in 1005 that refers to Brian as Imperator Scotorum, Emperor of the Irish, the only Irish king ever given that title in a contemporary document. He died at Clontarf on the day his forces won. He was approximately 70 years old. He was killed in his tent after the battle had turned by a fleeing Viking warrior named Brodir of the Isle of Man. His bodyguards were not there. They had gone to watch the battle end. His son Murchad had already been killed on the battlefield that same day. The dynasty that descended from Brian, the Dal Cais of Munster, ruling from their base in what is now County Clare and Tipperary, carried his name forward as Uí Briain, descendants of Brian, which became O'Brien in anglicised form. They ruled Munster as kings for centuries after his death. They remained one of the most powerful Gaelic dynasties in Ireland through the Norman period, and the name spread so widely that today O'Brien is one of the 10 most common surnames in Ireland. But most people named O'Brien have never been told this. They know the name. They don't know that the name is a genealogical claim, that every family who took the name O'Brien was asserting to any Gaelic Irish person who heard it a connection to the man who came closest to unifying Ireland under a single authority in the entire history of the island. If your name is O'Brien, your bloodline carries, encoded in 2 syllables, the most significant political achievement in Gaelic Irish history. But here's something the history books don't often say clearly. Brian's victory at Clontarf did not end Irish political fragmentation. It ended Viking military dominance. But within a generation of his death, the Gaelic kingdoms were fighting each other again. The unity he built was personal, tied to his authority, his relationships, his reputation. It died with him on that beach in Dublin, which means that what the O'Brien name actually commemorates is not a lasting political structure. It's a man, one extraordinary man, and the decision of his descendants to carry his name forward as an identity, a pride, a declaration across 1,000 years. That is what a surname can hold. Stop here for a moment. Let that land. Number 8 carries a name with a Viking root, and the story of how that root became one of the most Gaelic names in Irish history is one of the stranger transformation stories in the entire record. The name is O'Ruarc. You know it as O'Rourke. The root is Hrothric, Old Norse. a personal name from the Viking Age carried into Ireland during the period of Scandinavian settlement and raiding that dominated the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries. And yet within 2 generations, the family that bore this name was indistinguishable, culturally, linguistically, politically, from any native Gaelic Irish dynasty. This was not unusual. The Viking settlements in Ireland were not purely extractive. Many of the Norse who came to Ireland stayed. They intermarried with Gaelic families. They learned Irish. Their children grew up bilingual. Their grandchildren were, by every practical measure, Irish, with Norse names that had been absorbed into the Gaelic naming system. The O'Ruarc dynasty ruled Bryfna, a kingdom straddling what are now counties Leitrim and Cavan in the northern Midlands of Ireland. It was not the largest kingdom in Ireland, but its geographic position made it one of the most strategically valuable. Bryfna controlled the land passage between Ulster in the north and Connacht in the west. In a period when armies moved on foot and on horseback, controlling that corridor meant controlling the movement of every military force that needed to cross between two of the most powerful provinces in Ireland. You could not invade from the north without crossing Bryfna. You could not reinforce Connaught from Ulster without O'Rourke's permission. Control it, and you had leverage over every kingdom around you. Tiernan O'Rourke, king of Bryfna in the mid-12th century, holds a complicated place in Irish history. And most people have never heard of him, even though what happened to him is one of the primary reasons Ireland looks the way it does today. In 1152, while Tiernan was away on a military campaign, Diarmait mac Murchada, king of Leinster, abducted his wife, Derb Forgail. The historical record on this event is genuinely ambiguous. Some contemporary sources suggest Derb Forgail may have been a willing participant. Others record it as a straightforward act of political humiliation directed at O'Rourke, a calculated insult designed to destabilize him. Regardless of the exact circumstances, the consequences were not ambiguous at all. Tiernan O'Rourke spent the next 14 years pursuing vengeance against Diarmait mac Murchada. Their conflict eventually contributed to the political situation that led mac Murchada to seek military help from England, which led to the Norman invasion of 1169, which led to 7 centuries of English involvement in Ireland. One personal grievance, one act of humiliation on one afternoon in 1152, and the entire subsequent history of Ireland shifts. If your name is O'Rourke, your bloodline governed the most strategically critical corridor in medieval Ireland, and your ancestors' personal feud may be the most consequential private dispute in Irish history. The next surname is one the English crown specifically targeted for destruction, not suppressed in the general way that Gaelic culture was suppressed, systematically disadvantaged, discouraged, legally marginalized. This family was specifically identified, by name, in Tudor administrative correspondence, as a dynasty whose military capacity had to be broken before English authority in Ireland could be considered secure. The Lord Deputy of Ireland wrote letters about them. The Privy Council in London discussed them. They were not just a problem, they were the problem, the obstacle, the dynasty that kept defeating English armies in the field. Number 7. O'Neill. You know it as O'Neill. The Gaelic root Niall, possibly meaning champion, possibly meaning passionate or intense, the etymology is genuinely debated, was the name of a 5th century figure whose historical and legendary biography is intertwined so thoroughly that separating them may be impossible. Niall of the 9 Hostages, High King of Ireland in the late 4th and early 5th centuries. The Uí Néill dynasty, his descendants, spread across the north of Ireland over the following generations, establishing kingdoms in Ulster that persisted for over 1,000 years. The O'Neill dynasty of Tyrone was the senior branch. Their seat of power was the hill of Tullyhogue in County Tyrone, where the O'Neill kings were inaugurated in a stone ceremonial chair, a chair that English forces deliberately destroyed in 1602 as a symbolic act of conquest. The most significant O'Neill in the historical record is Hugh O'Neill, the Earl of Tyrone, who led what became known as the 9 Years' War from 1593 to 1603, the most serious military challenge to English rule in Ireland between the Norman invasion and the revolutionary period of the 20th century. Hugh O'Neill was not a simple rebel. He was a political genius who had spent years inside the English colonial system, learned how it worked, and then used that knowledge against it. He built a coalition of Irish lords. He negotiated military support from Spain. He trained his forces in contemporary European infantry tactics, moving away from the traditional Gaelic style of warfare that English commanders had learned to counter. In 1598, his forces met an English army at the Battle of the Yellow Ford on the Blackwater River. What followed was the single largest defeat of English forces in Irish history. Over 2,000 English soldiers killed, their commander dead, the Queen's army broken. The news reached Elizabeth I in London. By contemporary accounts, she never fully recovered her composure regarding Irish affairs after that day. But by 1603, after years of sustained campaigning, Spanish support that arrived too late and in the wrong place, and the death of Elizabeth replaced by a Scottish king with no particular sympathy for Irish Gaelic culture, O'Neill's coalition collapsed. In 1607, Hugh O'Neill and the other surviving Gaelic lords, including O'Donnell of Tyrconnell, left Ireland permanently. They sailed from Lough Swilly in County Donegal, 99 people on 2 ships, crossing to the continent. The event is called the Flight of the Earls, and Irish historians mark it as the end of the Gaelic order, the moment when the last dynasty, capable of military resistance to English colonization, removed itself from the field. The hill of Tullyhogue was already rubble. If your name is O'Neill, your bloodline comes from the most powerful dynasty in Ulster across a period of over 1,000 years, a family that held their territory through Viking raids, Norman invasion, and Tudor colonization, and lost it only when the entire Gaelic political order collapsed around them. Number 6 is the last to fall, the westernmost kingdom, the most remote, the most difficult to reach, the territory where Gaelic culture survived most intact, longest, and where the most ancient Irish surnames have been preserved in their highest concentration. O Flaithparte, O'Flaherty. The Gaelic root, Flaithpartach, means bright ruler, or ruler of valor. The literal translation is something like brilliant in conduct. It's a name that describes the ideal of Gaelic kingship, not just military power, but the quality of rule itself. The O'Flaherty dynasty controlled Ire Connaught, Western Connaught, the territory west of Lough Corrib in what is now County Galway. Their land was Atlantic coastline, mountain, bog and island, terrain that Norman cavalry could barely operate in, territory that provided no agricultural surplus worth the effort of conquering, a geography that simply was not worth the resources required to occupy. So the Normans largely left it alone, and the O'Flahertys remained. They remained as one of the last substantially autonomous Gaelic dynasties in Ireland, still exercising real territorial authority centuries after most other Gaelic kingdoms had been absorbed, displaced, or destroyed. The medieval city of Galway, a Norman and later Anglo-Irish merchant town on the eastern edge of O'Flaherty territory, was so consistently threatened by the family that the town authorities eventually inscribed a prayer in stone above the western gate of the city walls. The prayer read, "From the ferocious O'Flahertys, good Lord deliver us." That inscription was real. It existed. Contemporary sources document it. The people of Galway considered the O'Flahertys a force of nature, unpredictable, aggressive, and absolutely unwilling to accept that the Norman town on the edge of their territory had any authority over them. Grace O'Malley, Graine Ní Mhaile, the 16th century pirate queen of Connaught, one of the most extraordinary women in Irish history, was married into the O'Flaherty family by her first marriage to Donald O'Flaherty. She outlived him, went on to command her own fleet of ships, and eventually sailed to England to negotiate directly with Queen Elizabeth I, in Latin, since neither woman spoke the other's language. If your name is O'Flaherty, your bloodline governed the wild west of Ireland so effectively that a city carved a prayer about you into their wall. We're halfway through the list. What comes next shifts the story away from kings and soldiers entirely, and into something that, in Gaelic Ireland, was arguably more powerful than either. In Gaelic Ireland, there was a class of people who held no army. They commanded no territory. They collected no taxes. They did not ride into battle at the head of a column of warriors. And yet every king in Ireland treated them with a caution bordering on fear, because these people held something more dangerous than a sword. They held memory. They held language. They held the power to decide how history remembered you. In a civilization where reputation was currency, where a king's legitimacy depended not just on military power, but on the stories told about him, the genealogies recited at his inauguration, the praise poems composed in his honor, the satirical verses that could follow him to his grave and beyond. The people who controlled those words controlled everything. They were called the Fili, the poets, and the family at number 5 on our list were the greatest of them. Number 5, O'Dalai. You know it as O'Daly, sometimes anglicized as Daly or Daly. The Gaelic root, Dalach, means one who participates in assemblies, one who speaks in councils. The name itself encodes the function. This was a family whose role was language, deliberation, the formal articulation of power. The O'Dalai were hereditary poets, but that word, poet, carries almost none of the weight it needs to hear. In Gaelic Ireland, the Fili were not simply artists, they were not entertainers. They occupied a legally defined role in Irish society with specific rights, specific protections, and specific powers that no other class, not merchants, not soldiers, not minor nobility, possessed. A Fili of the highest rank, an Olam, was entitled by Gaelic law to the same hospitality and the same legal protection as a king. Harming a poet was a serious crime under the Brehon law system, Ireland's indigenous legal code, which predated Roman law in Ireland and survived, in practical use in remote areas, until the 17th century. The reason for this protection was practical. A Fili could praise you, and a poet's praise, circulated through the oral and manuscript tradition of Gaelic Ireland, could cement your reputation across the entire island for generations. An Olam composing a eulogy for a king was not just writing a poem. They were constructing a historical record that would be recited, copied, and transmitted forward through time. But a Fili could also satirize you. And a satire, a formal poetic satire, composed by a poet of the highest rank, circulated through the same networks, was devastating. Contemporary sources describe the power of poetic satire to raise blemishes on a king's skin, a psychosomatic response that may sound like superstition, but almost certainly reflects the real social and psychological terror of being publicly, poetically, permanently condemned by the most respected cultural authority in your civilization. Kings paid their poets generously, not just out of appreciation for art, out of rational self-interest. The O'Dalai family produced generations of Fili who served the great Gaelic dynasties, the O'Briens of Munster, the O'Connors of Connaught, the O'Neills of Ulster. Their work survives. The Royal Irish Academy in Dublin holds manuscripts containing O'Dalai compositions dating back to the 12th century, among the oldest vernacular literary texts in Europe. Muradach O'Dalai, one of the most celebrated poets of the medieval period, composed work so technically complex that scholars today still debate the full meaning of certain passages. He was also, according to the Annals, forced to flee Ireland after killing a tax collector who insulted him, because even a poet of his rank could not kill a royal official without consequences. He spent years in Scotland before negotiating his return. The man was a poet. He was also capable of killing someone in anger and then using his professional reputation to negotiate his way back from exile. This is what the O'Dalai family actually were. If your name is O'Daly or Daly or Daly, your bloodline did not carry swords. They carried something the kings of Ireland feared more. They carried the power to determine how history remembered every powerful person who ever lived. Sit with that for a moment. Because number 4 is completely different. Number 4 goes to the battlefield, and to a type of warrior so distinctive, so specifically feared, that English military commanders in the 16th century wrote formal reports about them. Those reports still exist. Number 4, MacSwiney. You know it as McSweeney, sometimes Sweeney or Sweeney. The root is Svein, Old Norse again, as with O'Rourke, a young man, a warrior. A name from the Viking world that crossed into Ireland and became, in this family's hands, something the Norse themselves would have recognized as formidable. The MacSwiney family were galloglass. That word, galloglass, from the Irish galloglai, meaning foreign warriors, refers to one of the most significant military developments in medieval Irish history. In the 13th century, as Gaelic Irish kings struggled to counter the military advantages of Norman heavy cavalry and castle-based warfare, they began importing professional soldiers from the Scottish Western Isles and Highlands. Scottish Gaelic warriors, descendants of mixed Norse and Gaelic ancestry who had developed a specific style of fighting that was different from both the Irish and the Norman traditions. The Galloglass fought on foot. They carried a weapon called the Sparth, a long-handled axe with a broad, heavy blade designed for maximum impact against armored opponents. They wore mail armor at a time when most native Irish warriors fought in lighter equipment. They were disciplined, trained, expensive, and extraordinarily effective. They did not break. That was the reputation. In a medieval battle, where most infantry would eventually reach a breaking point under pressure, would turn and run, would collapse, the Galloglass held. English commanders in the field consistently documented this. Their formations maintained cohesion under conditions that would have scattered other troops. 3 branches of the Mac Sweeney family controlled separate territories in Ulster and served as hereditary military commanders to the O'Donnell kings of Tyrconnell, the dynasty that ruled what is now County Donegal. Mac Sweeney Banach, controlling the southwestern peninsula. Mac Sweeney Fanad, controlling the northern peninsula. Mac Sweeney na Duath, governing the central territories. Each branch was a military institution. The relationship between the Mac Sweeneys and the O'Donnells was not simply employment. It was hereditary alliance, formalized through generations of intermarriage and mutual obligation. You did not hire a Mac Sweeney the way you hired a mercenary. You inherited the relationship. It was written into the genealogies of both families. Sir Henry Sidney, Lord Deputy of Ireland in the 1560s and 70s, wrote dispatches to London describing the Galloglass in terms that barely conceal his professional respect for them. He was trying to explain to the Privy Council why suppressing Ulster was so difficult. Part of the answer, he made clear, was the quality of the military forces that the O'Donnells and O'Neills could field, and the Mac Sweeneys were specifically named. These documents are held today in the State Papers Ireland collection at the UK National Archives. If your name is Mac Sweeney or Sweeney, your bloodline were the professional soldiers that Irish kings paid specifically, carefully, over generations, because no one else in Ireland fought quite like them. The next name goes somewhere entirely different. Not to the battlefield, not to the poet's hall, to a monastery, to the most important centre of learning in early medieval Ireland, a place where Irish monks preserved the intellectual inheritance of Western civilization through the dark centuries when it was disappearing almost everywhere else, and to the family whose specific function was to protect it. Number 3. O Maoila Laid. You know it as O Malloy. The Gaelic root, Maol, means tonsured one, or devotee, the shaved head of a monk. The name encodes religious dedication. This was a family whose identity was intertwined from its origins with the practice of Christianity in its distinctly Irish form. The O Maoila Laid dynasty ruled Fir Chiel, a territory in what is now County Offaly in the Irish Midlands, sitting at the junction between the kingdoms of Leinster, Munster and Connaught. Strategically positioned, fought over repeatedly, a territory small enough that it could not simply dominate its neighbours through military strength, but important enough that every powerful kingdom around it had reasons to want it controlled by friendly hands. But the role that makes the O Maoila Laid name genuinely significant in Irish history is not their military or political position. It's their function as hereditary protectors of Clonmacnoise. Clonmacnoise, on the western bank of the River Shannon, near what is now Athlone. Founded in the mid-6th century by Saint Ciaran of Clonmacnoise, who died, according to the Annals, at approximately 33 years old, having established what would become one of the most important institutions in the history of European Christianity. At its height, Clonmacnoise was not just an Irish monastery, it was an international centre of scholarship, attracting students and scholars from Britain, continental Europe and beyond. The manuscripts produced there, illuminated texts, historical chronicles, theological works, legal documents, represent some of the oldest surviving vernacular literature in any European language. The Annals of Tigernach, one of the major Irish chronicles, was compiled at Clonmacnoise. The Labor na Huidre, the Book of the Dun Cow, the oldest surviving manuscript of Irish mythological literature, compiled around 1100, was produced there. And the monastery was attacked, repeatedly. The Annals of Ulster record Viking raids on Clonmacnoise in 833, 845, 847, and multiple subsequent years. Norse fleets came up the Shannon, raided the buildings, took valuables, sometimes killed monks, sometimes took them as slaves. Then came rival Irish kingdoms, using Clonmacnoise as a target in their territorial disputes. Then Normans. Then later, in 1552, an English garrison stationed nearby looted the site so thoroughly that contemporary observers wrote that nothing was left inside the walls. Through most of this history, the O'Mauilalide kings of Fir Chiel are documented in the Annals as defenders of Clonmacnoise. Not every attack was stopped, not every raid was repelled. But the relationship between this family and this monastery was consistent, documented, and recorded across centuries. They were not the monks. They were the people who stood between the monks and everyone who wanted to destroy what the monks were building. If your name is O'Malloy, your bloodline protected the place where Ireland's oldest books were written, where the mythological and historical memory of Gaelic civilization was preserved in ink on vellum through centuries of fire and raiding and political collapse. The books survived, in part because of that family. Don't skip past this to get to number 1, because number 2 holds the most uncomfortable story on this entire list. The name at number 2 belongs to a dynasty that changed Irish history permanently. Not through heroism, not through resistance, but through a decision made by one man in a moment of desperation and fury. A decision that invited the Norman world into Ireland. Number 2, Mac Murchada. You know it as MacMurrough, sometimes Kavanagh. We'll explain that in a moment. The Gaelic root, Murchad, means sea warrior, sea battler. A name from the Atlantic coast, from a civilization that understood the sea not as a boundary, but as a highway. The Mac Murchada dynasty were kings of Leinster, the southeastern province of Ireland, covering what are now counties Wexford, Carlow, Kilkenny, Lowis, Offaly, Kildare, Wicklow and Dublin. The richest agricultural land in Ireland, the most accessible coastline, the province closest to Britain, the territory that any outside force arriving by sea would reach first. The Mac Murchada kings had held Leinster for generations. They were not a minor dynasty. They were one of the major powers in Gaelic Ireland, wealthy, militarily capable, with extensive genealogical claims and political connections across the island. And then came Diarmait Mac Murchada, King of Leinster, in the mid-12th century. Diarmait was, by the accounts that survive, a formidable and deeply contentious figure. He was ambitious beyond what Leinster alone could satisfy. He was aggressive toward his neighbours. He was involved in the abduction of Dub Forgail, the wife of Tiernan O'Rourke, the event we discussed at number 8, the one that began the chain of personal vendettas that would ultimately destabilise Irish politics. By 1166, Diarmait had accumulated enough enemies that Ruaidrí Uar Conchobair, Rory O'Connor, the reigning High King of Ireland, moved against him with a coalition force that Diarmait could not defeat in the field. Diarmait was expelled from Ireland. Most deposed kings accepted exile, found refuge at a foreign court, waited for political circumstances to change, negotiated their return through diplomatic channels. That was the pattern. Diarmait did something no Irish king had done before, and no Irish king has done since. He went to King Henry II of England and asked for permission to recruit military assistance to reclaim his kingdom. Henry gave his blessing, not troops, not direct military support, but royal permission to recruit from Henry's subjects in England and Wales. Diarmait took that permission to Pembrokeshire in Wales, where a community of Cambro-Norman lords, Anglo-Norman families settled in Wales, men who were militarily experienced, land-hungry, and looking for opportunities, were available to be recruited. The most important of them was Richard de Clare, the Earl of Pembroke, known to history as Strongbow, one of the most effective military commanders in the Norman world. A man who had lost political favour in England and had every reason to take a risk on a new campaign in Ireland. Diarmait offered him his daughter Awaf in marriage, and with her the succession to the kingdom of Leinster. In 1169, the first Norman forces landed on the beach at Bannow Bay in County Wexford. By 1171, Henry II himself had come to Ireland to assert royal authority over the situation that was developing. The Norman invasion. The event that everything in Irish history since then flows from. The beginning of the relationship, or the entanglement, or the occupation, depending on which historian you read, between Ireland and England. Started by one man, one king, expelled from his kingdom, who chose to invite a foreign military force into his country rather than accept the consequences of losing. The Mac Murchada descendants who survived the subsequent centuries adopted the surname Kavanagh, from Caum Hanach, meaning devotee of Saint Kevin. A name taken after one of Diarmait's sons was fostered at the monastery of Glendalough. The name change was a kind of historical distancing. The Kavanaghs were Mac Murchada blood, but they shed the surname that had become, in Irish historical memory, a byword for the worst thing an Irish king could do. If your name is MacMurrough or Kavanagh, your bloodline were kings of Leinster. Great kings, by any objective measure. Powerful, wealthy, entrenched across centuries. And your most famous ancestor made a decision in 1166 that changed Ireland permanently, in ways that are still unresolved today. We have one name left. There is a hill in County Tyrone. It's called Tullyhogue. In Irish, Tulach Og, the young hill, or the hill of the young. It doesn't look like much today. A raised earthwork, some trees. A view across the countryside that is genuinely beautiful but gives no obvious indication that what happened here for centuries was among the most significant rituals in Irish political life. On this hill, the kings of the Uí Néill were inaugurated. Not crowned, Gaelic Irish kingship did not use a crown. The incoming king was seated in a stone chair, a ceremonial inauguration seat that had stood on Tullyhogue for generations. A white wand was placed in his hand, symbolizing the authority being conferred. The O'Hagans and the O'Quinns, the hereditary inauguration families, presided over the ceremony. The assembled lords of Ulster witnessed it. And in 1502, Hugh O'Neill, the man who would become the Earl of Tyrone, the man who would later lead the 9 Years' War and defeat the English at the Yellow Ford, was inaugurated on that hill, in that chair, in the old way. A century later, in 1602, as the 9 Years' War was ending in O'Neill's defeat, an English military force under Lord Mountjoy arrived at Tullyhogue. They destroyed the inauguration chair, deliberately, systematically. They understood exactly what they were doing. The chair was not valuable as an object. It was valuable as a symbol, as the physical anchor of a political legitimacy that stretched back over 1,000 years. Destroy the chair, and you severed the ritual. You announced in the clearest possible terms that the old system was finished, that the authority it had conferred no longer existed. The hill is still there, the chair is gone. Number 1. Uí Néill. The name that contains all the others. You know its direct modern form as O'Neill. But the Uí Néill dynasty, the descendants of Niall, is not one surname. It is a genealogical category, a genetic and historical designation that encompasses dozens of surnames, all tracing their lineage back through the branches of one enormous family tree to a single founding figure. Niall of the 9 Hostages, Níl Noí Geallach in Irish, High King of Ireland in the late 4th and early 5th centuries. The historical record on Niall is fragmentary, as it is with almost all figures from this period. But the genealogical manuscripts of medieval Ireland, the Lebor Gabala Érenn, the Annals of Ulster, the genealogical tracts preserved in the Book of Leinster and the Book of Ballymote, are unanimous on one point. The dynasties of Northern Ireland, the O'Neills, the O'Donnells, the O'Gallaghers, the O'Dohertys, the O'Gormleys, the McLaughlins, dozens more, all trace their male line descent from Niall. For centuries, this was treated as historical tradition, genealogical claim, the kind of founding ancestor story that medieval dynasties constructed for themselves, sometimes accurately, sometimes not. Scholars accepted it as culturally significant while remaining appropriately cautious about its literal truth. And then, in 2006, the caution became unnecessary. A research team, including scientists from Trinity College Dublin and the University of Edinburgh, published a study in the American Journal of Human Genetics. The study examined Y chromosome data from over 1,200 men across Ireland, with particular focus on men whose surnames were historically associated with the Uí Néill dynasty. The Y chromosome is the genetic structure that passes from father to son, generation after generation, with very little change. It is, in the most literal biological sense, a record of male line descent. And what the study found was this: a specific Y chromosome haplotype, a genetic signature, a pattern of markers on the Y chromosome that appears together and is passed down as a unit, was present in the population at a frequency that could not be explained by random distribution. In men with surnames historically associated with the Nail lineage, O'Neill, O'Donnell, O'Gallagher, O'Doherty, and related names, this haplotype appeared at extraordinary rates. In some surname groups, over 60% of men tested carried it. It was concentrated most heavily in the northwest of Ireland, in Ulster, in exactly the geographic territory where the Nail kingdoms had been centered for over 1,000 years. And the researchers calculated its current global distribution. Approximately 3 million men worldwide carry this specific Y chromosome signature, 1 in 12 men born in Ireland. The highest concentration in County Donegal and surrounding Ulster counties, with significant distribution in Scotland, in the Irish diaspora communities of the United States, Australia, Canada, and Britain. 3 million men, 1 genetic signature, 1 ancestral source. The study's lead authors were careful in their language, as scientists must be. They noted that other explanations for this distribution are theoretically possible, but the concentration, the geographic pattern, the surname correlation, and the historical record all pointed to the same conclusion. The Nail Y chromosome signature is real. It survived 1,500 years of war, displacement, colonization, famine, and diaspora. And it is still alive, in bodies, in families, in men who may never have heard the name Nile of the 9 hostages, in numbers that make it one of the largest documented genetic dynasties in human history. Think about what that means in human terms, not in the abstract, in the specific. Think about a man, maybe your grandfather, maybe your great-grandfather, maybe someone 6 generations back who you will never know by name, who got on a ship during the famine years of 1845 to 1852. 1 million people died, another million emigrated. They left with almost nothing. The name often was the only thing they could carry without weight. That name arrived in New York, or Boston, or Liverpool, or Melbourne. It got anglicized further, sometimes. O'Neill became Neil, or even Nelson. O'Donnell became Donald, or Donnell. The connections blurred, the history went underground again, but the Y chromosome went with them. Unchanged, uncorrupted, exactly as it was on the hill at Tullyhogue, exactly as it was in the body of whoever carried it in the 5th century on the western coast of Ireland, at the beginning of the historical record. 1,500 years of survival, of continuity, of one unbroken biological thread connecting a man alive today to a king who lived before England existed as a political entity. That is what a surname can point to. That is the coordinate the name carries. Now let's close the full list. 10 surnames, 10 bloodlines, 10 corridors leading back through the written and genetic record of Gaelic Ireland. O'Kelly carried a kingdom in Western Connaught across more than 1,000 years of recorded history. The name encoded contention, strife, the act of fighting, and the family proved it generation after generation. O'Brien, encoded in 2 syllables, the most significant political achievement in Gaelic Irish history. The name of Brian Boru, the only man recognized as High King of all Ireland by every kingdom simultaneously, preserved in the families of his descendants and spread across the island until it became one of the most common names in Ireland. O'Ruarc, a Viking name absorbed into Gaelic identity, governing the most strategically critical corridor in medieval Ireland. The family whose personal feud in 1152 may have set in motion 7 centuries of English involvement in Irish affairs. O'Neill, the senior branch of the Nail, governing Ulster for over 1,000 years, fighting English colonization for 4 centuries and losing their homeland only when the entire Gaelic political order collapsed around them. Their inauguration chair destroyed, their earls in exile, their genetic signature surviving in 3 million people worldwide. O'Flaherty, rulers of the wild Atlantic West, remote enough that Norman power never fully reached them, fierce enough that a city carved a prayer about them in stone above a gate, connected by marriage to the most extraordinary woman in Irish history. O'Daly, the hereditary poets, the Fili, the family whose power was not military or territorial, but linguistic and mnemonic. The family that decided how history remembered every king who ever lived, and whose compositions survive today in the oldest vernacular literary manuscripts in Europe. MacSweeney, the Gallowglass, the hereditary heavy infantry whose name came from Norse and whose fighting tradition came from the Western Isles of Scotland, who held their ground in battle with a discipline that English commanders documented and could not fully counter for generations. O Mawelaid, O Malloy, kings of the Irish Midlands, whose most significant function was as protectors of Clonmacnoise, the monastery where Ireland's oldest manuscripts were written, where the mythological and historical memory of Gaelic civilization was preserved through Viking raids, political collapse, and centuries of instability. Mac Murchada, MacMurrough, Kavanagh, kings of Leinster, powerful and ancient, whose most famous member made the decision in 1166 that invited the Normans into Ireland, changed the history of the island permanently, and left a surname that his own descendants eventually abandoned. And Uí Néill, the dynasty that contains all dynasties. The genetic root, the Y chromosome signature that connects 3 million living men to the northern kingdoms of Gaelic Ireland, to the hill at Tullyhogue, to a stone chair that was deliberately destroyed because the people who destroyed it understood its power. 10 names, 1 island. A history that was almost erased and didn't disappear. It went into the genetics, into the manuscripts, into the names people carry today without knowing what they hold. Your name is not just Irish, it is a kingdom that survived. It is a bloodline that endured Viking raids, Norman conquest, Tudor suppression, penal laws, famine, diaspora, and arrived here, in the present moment, still recognizable, still pointing back through time to a specific place, a specific people, a specific story. You did not choose this name, you inherited it. The way you inherit a genetic signature, the way a river inherits its course from the geology of the land it flows through. It was shaped by people who lived before your country existed, before your language existed in its current form, before most of the borders on any map you've ever looked at were drawn, and it survived. Drop your surname in the comments below. Tell me which Irish kingdom your family came from, or tell me you don't know yet that you found this today, that the name you've been writing your whole life just opened into something larger than you expected. And if you know the story your family carried out of Ireland, whether they left during the famine on a ship with 400 people and inadequate food, whether they were displaced by the plantations in the 17th century and ended up in Scotland or the Americas, whether they simply left in the 20th century looking for work and a future that Ireland couldn't provide, say it. Write it in the comments, because those stories are not separate from what you just heard. They are the continuation of it. The next chapter, the part of the record that hasn't been written into a manuscript yet. Be specific. Tell me the county. Tell me the generation. Tell me what your family said about where they came from, even if it was vague, even if it was just the West or the North or somewhere near Cork. Those fragments matter. They're the living end of a thread that stretches back over 1,000 years. If you made it here, to the end of this list, through 10 dynasties and 15 centuries of Irish history, share this video with one person in your family who carries an Irish surname and has never been told this story. One share. One person. Someone who's been signing their name for decades without knowing what they're holding. That conversation, the one that starts when they watch this, that is exactly the kind of conversation that keeps this history alive. Next week, we're going inside a document that most people have never heard of. The Leabhar Clain Suibne, the Book of the MacSweeneys, a genealogical manuscript compiled in the 16th century, held today in a private collection, that contains information about Gaelic Irish military families that does not appear in any public historical record. And alongside it, we'll be examining something that the Tudor administration in Ireland tried very hard to suppress. A set of internal correspondence from the 1580s in which English officials describe, in their own words, how afraid they actually were of the Gaelic military tradition. Not the official version, the private version. What they wrote to each other when they thought no one else was reading. That's next week. Your name brought you here. Come back and find out what else it can tell you.